This evening I'm conducting an interview with Steve Shellabarger. It is September 6, 2005, 6 p.m. at Steve's home at 948 Neal Avenue in Columbus, Ohio. Could you go ahead and state your name?
Stephen Myers Shellabarger.
And what is your ethnic or racial background?
I guess I'm Caucasian.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up actually in Dayton. I was born in Columbus, but my family moved to Dayton, Ohio when I was like 2 years old. And I grew up in Dayton, went to high school at Oakwood High School in Dayton, and then upon graduation came to Ohio State, and then just stayed after I graduated from Ohio State of Columbus.
And how old are you today?
I am 60.
All right. And what is your earliest memory from childhood?
Oh, wow. I have no idea. I never have thought about it, actually. You know, I really don't have anything terribly distinct. I remember, being pretty small with my grandparents and, holidays and things like that, but nothing earth-shattering.
All right. When you were a kid, were there particular people that you looked towards as being heroes or role models?
Well, of course, my parents were very important, and I came from very much a traditional 50s family. I had one brother, an older brother, who was 5 years older than I and my parents, and it was just the old 50s TV family. I never, in my entire life, heard my parents argue. Not one voice ever raised by either one of them to the other. My father worked very hard and worked very long hours. But goodness, always provided for us magnificently. There was nothing that I ever really wanted that I didn't have. Obviously, we were taught moderation in certain things, but I mean, they always provided for us from the day I was born until I graduated from Ohio State and beyond. My parents were always very generous with myself and with my brother and with my brother's children. And my mom died quite young. My dad, on the other hand, just died 3 months ago at the ripe old age of 97.
How old were you when you first realized that you were gay or that you might be gay?
I knew I was gay when I was like 5 or 6 or something like that. And I do have it, speaking of early memories, this I have an early memory of. My grandparents had a little cottage in Michigan. And I can remember as a kid, and I mean, it was sold when I was like 10, so it had to be well before that. And my grandmother would buy these TV and movie magazines. And I already knew that it was the pictures of the males in those, especially the ones at the beach, that attracted me. And I can still remember that from that time. And, so maybe 5 or 6 years old.
How old were you when you first disclosed to another person that you thought you might be gay?
Well, I never disclosed it to anybody until I came out. And I came out when I was 21.
And when you came out when you were 21, who did you tell?
I actually, the first person I told was a female friend of mine who I had gone to high school with and who was also at Ohio State. And I came out just prior to graduation in the spring of 1969. I had actually forgotten this, and we had sort of a reunion. Linda lives now in Columbus with her husband and kids, but I hadn't seen her for quite a while, and we got together a few months ago for the first time in maybe 5 or 6 years, and she reminded me of that I had come over and told she and her roommate Patty, who now lives in Cincinnati, what had happened, and I just got smashed. She said, "I've never seen anybody as drunk as you were that night."
And what was her reaction to you?
She was great. Linda was my liberal friend. I was a real dyed-in-the-wool conservative Republican, because that's the way I was brought up. And we all make stupid mistakes. And Linda was my liberal friend, and she was from a very liberal background and big Democrats and so forth. So we had had lots of political discussions over the years, and so she was the one person I knew I could go to because I knew it would be okay, and it was. It was. And that was helpful because it gave me somebody that really gave me some support. Because I didn't know who else I could talk to, and I didn't talk to anybody else. God knows I wouldn't talk to anybody in my family. And you're certainly not going to go to other straight people unless they're terribly close and you felt great confidence that they would be accepted. Remember, this is 1967.
Did you know other gay people at that time?
None. I didn't know there was another gay person in the whole world.
What finally pushed you to approach somebody and talk about?
You know, it was such a different time. When I was a kid, when I was in high school, there was a bookstore in downtown Dayton called Wilkie News. I think it might still be there. And they had muscle magazines. And so I would go downtown, scared to death, and go into Wilkie News because I had these urges, and it was the only way that I could satisfy them that I could figure out. And I'm still amazed because there was a big sign that said you must be 18 to look at these magazines. Well, I was down there probably when I was 14 or 15. I suspect I was getting on the bus to go down and buy these magazines. And I always have looked pretty young for my age. So if I was 15, I probably looked 12. And I'm still amazed that no one ever prevented me from buying them. They never did. That was it. I mean, you know, there was, you just didn't have an outlet, even though you knew. And people don't realize this, but it wasn't until 1966, 67, somewhere in that vicinity, that any publication ever talked about homosexuality. And I think it was Time Magazine did a cover story someplace in that era about homosexuality and the gay community. I don't even know if they talked about it as the gay community. That'd be an interesting thing to go back and look up. But I remember that it was very meaningful to me to see that first discussion. And it wasn't necessarily a very positive one, but to see that first discussion. I can remember in high school going into the library and getting into encyclopedias and things like that and looking up homosexuality. I mean, but that was it. You had no one to go and talk to. You were scared to death because, you know, unless you stumbled on to somebody else, and of course I have many friends who did. I never did. And interestingly enough, to this day, I went to my 40th class reunion. I do not know of another gay person in my graduating class from Oakwood High School of 130 people. Now, I assume there must be some. But the one guy that I thought for sure just got married. Now, I don't know what that means, but I always thought this guy was the one other person. His story is, I don't know. So there was just no opportunity. So the very first time that I had anything happen between my junior and senior year at Ohio State, two good friends of mine who were pledge brothers of mine, the three of us traveled in Europe for the summer. And we were in Europe for 12 weeks, and we traveled around on Eurail passes. And the 12-week trip cost me $2,000, if that tells you something about how things have changed. But we had a great time, and we stayed in hostels, and we stayed in inexpensive hotels, and I had my very first experience in Salzburg, Austria, where I was literally picked up, cruised the street, and was picked up by a guy by the name of Wolf, who was the typical Austrian, lots of blonde hair, very handsome, you know, and it scared the living shit out of me after I actually had a sort of a coming out experience, and then didn't do anything. That summer, and did nothing again until the next spring, and swore I'd never do this again, and all of that nonsense. And then, of course, the horns come back into existence, and one changes. I knew of no gay bars. They weren't publicized. I didn't know anybody to tell me about them.
How did you find out about the magazines at that bookstore?
I don't know. I have no idea whether I was just in there one time and saw them and saw, wow, look at this. That's all I can say. I have no idea.
Growing up, at the time when you were growing up, but when you were still living at home with your parents, were you aware of any other gay people in your family or in the community? Were there people within your family or community that were kind of...
Yeah, there were always a few people around that people snickered at, you know.
Do you recall anyone specifically?
There was one young man, and this is kind of interesting, who was a year behind me at Oakwood, and his name was Jackie, and he was quite femme, and everybody harassed him as Jackie, this kind of tough, who left Oakwood and went to New York and became the highest paid male model at that point in time in the United States. And of course was featured all over the Dayton papers and all this kind of stuff. And I always thought how fitting it was. Good for you, Jackie. You got back at it because you went on and became a huge success as a male model. And I don't mean, I mean, you know, clothing, magazines, and all that kind of stuff. And unfortunately, I learned later that he had died of AIDS. Not all that long, one of the fairly early ones, I believe. But, you know, and then there were a few other people that we teased, and I teased too, because it was your protection, you teased. Some things don't change.
Do you think people realized that you were different when you were a kid?
Generally speaking, I think I've had many people that I went to school with who have been surprised when they discovered that I was gay. I passed and made a lot of effort to pass.
Do you recall, you mentioned before that there was this kid in school that people snickered about. Were there other attitudes or instances of behavior that you recall towards gay people growing up?
I don't think very much. I think most people didn't think there were the gay people. I mean, I think we were so buried that other than those exceptions that came along once in a while who were really looked at as aberrations, I think the general feeling among the mass was that gay people were very, very rare. And it was seldom talked about. I mean, it wasn't an issue. No one ever thought about it. I mean, somebody might have a, you know, weird Uncle Harry or a strange Aunt Lucy that never married. But it wasn't talked about. And I don't remember growing up particularly as it very often ever even being discussed. And it was only when somebody came along like this kid who was quite feminine that there was even any teasing. It just wasn't, you know, like kids today throw around fag and queer and all of that stuff, and gay. I mean, those are all common terms. These were terms that nobody ever heard of in those days.
When you left home to go to Ohio State, what year was that?
1963.
And was that the first time you'd lived away from home?
Right.
What was that like, moving from Dayton to Columbus?
It was great. I loved it. I loved getting away from home, and I pledged to fraternity. I never went active, but I was sort of a perennial pledge. I had a lot of trouble. I partied hard at Ohio State. The finals almost flunked me out. You know, I had a terrible time adjusting to that because I was having a lot of fun. And frankly, I look back, and it's probably a good thing I didn't come out until I graduated because I'm not so sure with the party scene I would have ever graduated. Because when I came out, I really came out.
When you were going to Ohio State, did you date women, or did you...
Yeah, it was expected. It was, again, you passed. And in fact, I dated a gal for the last couple of years of college that everybody expected, including her, expected us to get married. And after I came out, I knew that there was no way that I was going to get married, and so I broke up with her. She never understood it, and she never forgave me. And to this day, I mean, I can tell you, she's still, because I have several friends who are mutual friends, and she just, I am a piece of shit in her eyes. She, of course, immediately wanted me to get therapy and all this, and I said, I'm not sick. I said, this is just the way I am. And she couldn't accept that. So she went off back to Bryan, Ohio, and got married to an attorney. I really don't know much about her since then.
After you came out, did you connect with the local gay scene, if there was any, and
sure.
How did that come about?
Well, I was actually very lucky because the young man who picked me up, who I still see around town, who, like me, is not a young man anymore. He and his partner live out in the burbs someplace, and his partner's a dentist, and I think actually retired now. But they were not together at the time, but he was with somebody else, actually, at the time. And so anyway, Mark picked me up at the Ohio Union. Because it was the one place I figured, if you're going to get picked up, it was at the library or the Union. And I was never brave enough to go up in the stacks, which probably would have, from everything I've heard, I've never been in the stacks, but from everything I've heard, probably is what I should have been doing. Maybe I should. Maybe it's better this way. But I went to the Union and saw him, and we kept cruising each other, and he finally approached me. And so that was my first experience here, other than the little thing that had happened in Europe. And he was very kind, and he had a lover, so obviously he was a little clandestine about the fact that we had just had this little event. But he introduced me to another young man here in town who was an artist. His name was Roberto, who did that vase up there under the globe, which he gave me in 1967. And just a really cool guy. And we, as young people do when they tend to come out, they tend to fall in love very easily. And so we went through that little bout. Well, he wasn't, Roberto wasn't. And he also had good sense. So he introduced me to somebody else, and within a very short period of time, I was in the gay social scene in Columbus, Ohio, up to my neck. But people don't understand that the gay social scene in Columbus, Ohio amounted to, I don't know, in 1967, 68, a couple of hundred people. I mean, the community was terribly small. The out community. Now, there were, of course, obviously thousands of people who were living closeted or doing the parks or doing the roadside parks, or occasionally might wander into a bar. I can tell you instances of people that I knew that I had run into in professional life who I would run into in the bar, and they would see me and they could literally go running out the door. So, I mean, it was a very small scene. There were, the Kismet, the old Kismet, when I first came out, I was only there once before they moved to where now the Eagle is, but that was the old Kismet. Then there was the Tradewinds, the original Tradewinds, which was down where the convention center is now. And then there was Rosemary's, Peppermint Lounge, which was directly across from the big Ohio entrance sign to the fairgrounds. And it's now a parking lot. But that was the dance club. And on Saturday night, on a busy Saturday night, maybe there'd be 150 people in there. And it didn't take long before you knew virtually everybody in town. And, literally, you knew everybody in town. And anybody who came into town from Cleveland or Cincinnati or Springfield or wherever, it was like, oh my God, it's a new face. And it was like the vultures gathered around the new face. And of course, it was great fun to go out of town because the same thing happened when you wandered into a different city. Especially if you were young and you were at all cute, you became the hot item for the night. there's nothing more fun than being the hot item of the night. So.
What were each of these individual bars that you named, the Kismet, the Tradewinds, and the Peppermint Lounge? Mm-hmm. What were they like? Like let's start with the Peppermint Lounge. What was it?
Okay, the Peppermint Lounge was just sort of a big cement block building, and I actually don't remember all that much about it, but God, I should have, probably because I drank too much when I was there. And some people hearing this or reading this will say, well, what's new? What's different about that? I don't remember too much about it. It was just a big bar. Sort of it seems to me it had a center bar, but
more than one room?
Physically, I kind of forget. I'm thinking it was pretty much one big room, but I honestly don't remember. Now, the Tradewinds was a smaller bar, non-dancing. It was a long bar. The front door faced on High Street, but with an old beat-up, tired awning over it that was literally falling apart, but hardly anybody went in the front door. You would park in the back and go in the back door because, of course, there were no lights, there were no signs on any of these. There were no signs. People didn't advertise these bars. And in the early days, you didn't even park in the back parking lot at the Tradewinds because the police were there every night writing down the license plate numbers. And almost nightly, the police would come into the Tradewinds and walk through the Tradewinds. And it was sort of a mixed bag. It depended upon who it was. Some of them were okay, and some of them looked at it as pure harassment. The laws were different. It was illegal, for example, for any man to dress in women's clothing if he didn't have underwear on. He had to have men's underwear on. Couldn't wear panties, I guess. It was illegal to kiss another man. And I had friends who were arrested because they happened to be drunk and the cops were in there and they leaned over and kissed somebody on the cheek and they were hauled off to jail. It was illegal to stand up with a drink in the city of Columbus. Now, laws like that were never enforced in the straight bars, but they were in the gay bars, so that when the police entered, everybody immediately sat down or put their drinks down, because otherwise you could end up being cited. There was no dancing. Dancing between people of the same sex was illegal. So all of the bars had some sort of signal to warn you that the police or the vice were in the bar, so that people would either hook up with somebody of the opposite sex or they would stop dancing. And most of the bars were segregated by gender, so there weren't all that many instances where there were men and women together. There were some at the Kismet, but seldom in the other bars. It was the mixing of men and women is much greater today than it was then, although unfortunately it's still to some degree segregated. So there were just all sorts of hurdles. It was talk about a clandestine existence. You figured out how to work the system, and you hoped, and you were careful, and there was fun in it. I mean, there's a mystery of all of that doing what is verboten. There's a bit of excitement in gay life that existed then that I don't think exists now, because now it's just so easy and so fine and so normal. But there was something fun about doing all of these things in the back seat, if you will.
Why were the police writing down license plate numbers?
It was purely harassment.
Are you aware of them ever,
No.
doing anything with them?
No, not that I know of.
Do you recall specifically the names of anyone that might have been arrested in a bar?
Norm Dolder.
I'm sorry, who?
Norm Dolder. He now lives in Florida. He lives in Naples. Just moved a couple of years ago, and if you called him and asked him about it, he'd probably pee down his leg. If you want to contact him, I should contact him first and tell you and ask him if he would be willing to talk with you about it. He might. Sure. Norm's a great guy. He's older. I'm 60. Norm's probably in his 70s someplace.
I was thinking there may be records too. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't know.
Because sometimes paperwork is interesting to look at.
I'm sure it would be. I'm sure it would be.
So you get precisely what people were charged
His
with.
situation, as I remember it, Norm was arrested because he had leaned over and kissed somebody on the cheek at the Tradewinds, I believe. Now, that's the way I remember it. Maybe it's completely wrong. But
Do you recall any other specific incidents?
Harold was arrested because he was drunk, walking down the middle of I don't know, some street downtown in a caftan. They arrested him for being drunk. He's dead now, so you can't talk to him. They had a jewelry store that competed with Argo and Laney. They were the two, shishi jewelry stores. It's now Willette Jewelers or something down on High Street, south of Lazarus. Orrin can tell you more about Harold. I don't know whether Orrin got into that, but he had the great story about Harold was he married this very prominent woman from Columbus. Back this would have been in the 40s, I guess. And they went off on their honeymoon, and they suddenly realized they were both gay. and for years, Harold was sort of the grand dame of the male community, and his ex-wife was sort of the grand dame of the lesbian community here in town. Betty was her name. But there are great stories with that one too. There's a whole book that could be written. And then Harold went to California with Orrin, whenever Orrin was in California, and he worked at Walt Disney Studios. And then he came back after the war, I guess, or whenever, came back and went into the family business. And Harold's been gone maybe 10 years.
What was it that you studied at Ohio State?
Well, I started off in architecture, and as I said, the fraternity was doing a real number on me, but I also discovered that I really didn't much like physics and calculus, especially calculus. I've never been able to understand calculus. I can do all the other stuff up to it. All of the rest, algebra and stuff, all makes sense to me. Geometry makes sense to me. Calculus makes no sense. So anyway, I was rapidly flunking out. And so I thought, what in the hell am I going to do? And I always have been a history buff. And I've always loved political science. I've been collecting political buttons since I was in the 50s. In those days, of course, it was my original Ike buttons and things like that. I still have them in the collection, but I've sort of switched around a bit there. But, so, I thought, well, history seemed to be something that I might be able to pass. And I would remember also these were Vietnam days. And so I was living on a student deferment, and I wasn't very excited. My older brother was professional Army and had actually served 2 or 3 tours in Nam. And I knew that was not the place for this queer. So education seemed to make some sense. So because you also, history, what are you going to do with a history degree? It's worth absolutely nothing unless you're going to be an attorney. And in those days, I didn't think I wanted to do that. I look back and I think that was probably a mistake, actually. And so I went from flunking out. It's very funny. I went from a .96, my third quarter in architecture, to a 3.7, my first quarter in education, and sort of coasted the rest of the way. And then I taught for 17 years. I was lucky. I graduated in 1967. It was a terrible job market for teachers, and there was only one social studies position open in the entire city, the whole central Ohio area. And the guy that I always have sort of wondered about that situation now, looking back. It's been a long time ago, but the guy that was my professor that was in charge of the student teachers, I don't even remember his name, but had taken a very great liking to me and used his influence to, frankly, get me the job in Whitehall, the one job that was open. And I don't realize how lucky I was. At the time, I didn't realize how lucky I was. Because without that job, I would have been drafted. And I don't know what I would have done. I don't suspect I would have gone into the military, but, that's a life-altering decision. So who knows?
So you went to work for the Whitehall school system right after you graduated.
Mm-hmm.
Teaching history.
Mm-hmm.
What grade?
High school.
High school?
Mm-hmm. 9 through 12.
And what was that like?
It was great. I loved it. I've told people I enjoyed teaching. I never regretted becoming a teacher, but I also never regretted leaving it after 17 years. 17 years was enough of other people's kids. But the gay issue, while it was there, and it was frightening because you were so vulnerable.
Explain what you mean by that.
Well, there were people in the city who were friends of mine that I was very careful not to be seen with because they were too flamboyant or whatever, or they were too notorious. And because it wasn't the kids. I don't think I was ever worried or afraid of the kids finding out. I think most of the kids, by the time I quit, I think most of the kids knew I was gay. It was their parents, and it was the school board. And we had some really right-wing crazies in Whitehall. We had a John Bircher who served on the Board of Education out there for years. And so there was that really nutty right-wing element out there. And so it always hung over your head. You always were afraid of what might happen. But that's the story of being gay and being closeted, is you're always afraid of what might happen. And as most of us learn, what we're afraid of is always much worse than reality. Very difficult to convince people of that, but it is true. Fears are much worse. But, so you never knew. And in those days, I mean, there were instances of people being fired from their jobs because it was discovered that they were gay. Some things haven't changed too much. I guess it still happens, but not as much. So you lived in, you lived in fear, and I think that molded me, and I think it molded a lot of us from that era, and in different ways. Some people reacted in different ways. Some people went deeply into the closet and still haven't emerged to this day. And I mean, there's, especially my generation and older, you find a lot of people who are scared to death of being themselves. And they resent those of us who have worked very hard to make it okay. So some people react that way, and then other people react, as I guess it eventually hit me, where I saw it as something that needed to be changed, not something that needed to be ceded to.
All right, I want to ask you next about a little bit different topic, but one that you have a lot of experience and knowledge in, and that is local politics. First, just to start off with some general questions, and then we'll get more into the meat of your...
Let me fill my wine glass. I'll talk better.
All right.
Would you like a glass of wine?
No, I'm fine.
Oh.
After you came out, but still in the earlier days here in Columbus, do you recall any persons that were either known to be gay or suspected of being gay, any local persons?
I don't know. Maybe if I thought about that one, I would come up with somebody. But just offhand, I can't think of anybody.
All right.
In that.
Back in the 60s and 70s, do you recall any local gay rallies or protests or?
Not really. And I will tell you, I was a party boy. I mean, when I was in my 20s and 30s, I would have been the equivalent of the circuit guys today. I mean, I had a ball. And I loved being gay, and I loved being out, and I loved all the stuff that went with it. I met my first partner in 71 or 72. And Stephen and I, he was a teacher, and we were together until he died in 1990. And we had our own thing. We were settled. I had bought a house right after I got out of, because that was the way I was trained. So in 1968, I bought my first house. It was a double in German Village. And German Village was very good to me. And German Village has been very good to the gay community. I don't think people realize how significant that geographic neighborhood is to the progress of the gay community in Columbus, Ohio. I think it's the one overriding reason that Columbus became and continues to be a center of gay acceptance and so forth.
And why is that?
Because it was a thriving, fun, restoration, pioneering area. And there was a huge number of gay people down there. But at the same time, for whatever reason, there were also a number of movers and shakers in the business and political community of Columbus that lived down there at one time or another. They may have only lived there for a couple years, Some of them lived there a lot longer. I mean, and I can go right down the list, and it's just, I mean, I think, and I'm sure I would miss a lot of people, but people like Janet Jackson, people like Cindy Lazarus, Greg Lashevka, Tom Moyer, well, and I can go, I mean, I can do Michael Colley, and I can go on and on and on about all of these folks. And so here we were in the 70s, and German Village was a party community. It was a community, but it was a party community. So, I mean, we had German Village, and so we all belonged to society, and we had the tour, and we did all that stuff. And in doing that, you got to meet all these people. So Greg Lashevka lived right around the corner from me, and he and his wife had little kids then. Now they're big kids, adults now. Used to come by and sing Christmas carols. And we'd go to Jim and Jan Barnes's, and Michael Colley was at Jim and Jan Barnes's at their party. And what's his name? Used to be head of Midland Music, Jerry Mayo, and his wife, Beth Mayo, big movers and shakers in town, partied with us. Michael Ford, a big Wheeler Republican Party, partied with us. And people got to know Cindy and all these. So, when the 80s hit, and when the crisis hit, we had connections, personal connections. I mean, and they had gotten to know all of these gay people on a social level. So, that was fine, and it just was never a big issue. I mean, we never really discussed it. There were no gay politics until the 80s, for all intents and purposes. It just didn't exist. We were gay. I lived with my partner. Everybody knew me, and everybody knew Steve, and they loved us as a couple. And it was all cool because we all lived in German Village, and we had this commonality of our neighborhood that we all loved and were developing. And everybody was interested in what everybody else did. Oh, you put new shutters on. Oh, you new paint color. Oh, and your house is going to be on the tour. Great. And we all worked together to make the tours happen. And it just was amazing. So when gay politics becomes something of an issue, we already had the connections. Or we had the entree. Tom and Marilyn Kaplan. Tom Kaplan was a city council person for a few years, and they became very good social friends. Well, their best friends are John and Annie Glenn. And Tom and Marilyn and I became quite good friends in those early days, and we had lots of partying together. And I mean, it was true partying. It was just fun. But then when we needed something, I was able to call Tom, and he arranged a meeting with John Glenn when he was United States Senator. So, and Greg Lashevka, of course, is mayor, and so we had all these connections. So, I mean, I just don't think we can overemphasize the importance of that community. I mean, I was just one of many. I mean, there were lots of other people doing the same sort of thing, making the same kind of content. It's just amazing. And I don't think very many communities have that kind of thing. I think it was just happenstance. I think it was luck. So we had, so the environment became very welcoming early on here. And that's why people came to Columbus, because they knew the environment was welcoming. No city in this country did more and was more receptive to our community in the AIDS crisis, in the early AIDS crisis in Columbus, Ohio. I don't think any. I don't think there was a city government that did more. And it was because Greg was mayor. It was because Teresa Long came here from San Francisco, and Bill Myers was the head of the health department. And Teresa had gotten to know gay people there and knew gay. I mean, and it just all came together. And Debbie Coleman, who should receive she should be princess of the gay community, I think. And never did talk about an unsung hero. They were right on the front lines from day one, and they were scraping money to get other cities, big cities, huge cities, were acting like, please go away, please go away. And Columbus was right there from early on with money and help, and the health department in the city has always been cooperative with the gay community, always. So that's what reason this town is so good. But I think it's luck, you know. It's just certain people and forces and whatever coming together at the right time.
Was the AIDS crisis your first involvement in?
Close. We had, when was Anita Bryant?
Oh, that was probably a couple years.
So a couple years
late 70s.
79 or something like that. A couple of guys that lived up on River Road. One of them was an attorney. Somebody called and said, "You've been reading about this Anita Bryant thing." Of course, it was getting a lot of press. So they said, "Well, we're going to raise money to send to Florida." Oh, okay. So we went to this big party, and I think it was $50 a person. I those days, $50 is a lot of money. That's probably the equivalent of a couple $100 today. And I mean, you know, at that point in time, I was a pretty young school teacher, 79. So I'd been teaching maybe 12 years or something. And so that was the first thing. We went out, and it was, you know, it's interesting how when you do stuff and with a group of people, and it's very empowering. And we raised, I don't know, $3,000 or $4,000 to get down and fight Anita Bryant. So that was really the first. But I had always really been interested in politics. I was very political, mentally. And I had wonderful mentors at Whitehall, other teachers that we had great times discussing. And then I got involved with the union out there. I was president of the Whitehall Education Association for a couple of years, and I was one of the people that led. We had to go on strike. I don't even remember what year it is. I'd have to dig to find. But it was right in that era. And so here was this conservative Republican from Dayton, Ohio, you know, right out on the front lines, sort of leading this strike against the Whitehall school system. My father, I thought, was going to pee down his pants. And, but, I mean, we were so right and they were so wrong. But you know, so I had some activism there and was involved politically out there and with OEA on some committees and things. And, you know, teachers are great organizers. I mean, that's one of the things that you're taught. And that's why the teachers' unions have always been so effective, and why, much as they hate to admit it, the Republicans love to get teachers' endorsements because they just know that they're workers and organizers. And so that's kind of where I got my feet wet. And I was pretty involved with OEA. And I guess that probably would have been the late 70s. I don't know. It's funny how you forget these things that seem like they're such huge parts of your life, and then you have trouble placing them in a decade, let alone a year. So that had been going on. But AIDS was the first thing that really galvanized all of us. Well, not all of us, but some of us. We were on our own. I mean, as much as I can say, yes, the city of Columbus stepped up to the plate and so forth, it's sort of all in comparison. We were the ones that pushed it. We organized our CATF. We organized it because nobody else was going to do it. The Red Cross sometimes would be helpful, sometimes not. United Way, sometimes helpful, sometimes not. You know, your friends are getting sick and dropping like flies. It's one of the most frightening, probably the most frightening experience, I think, that I've ever lived through was the 80s. It was something. I'll never forget, there was a guy, I don't remember his name, a gay man, worked for the Dispatch, and got the Dispatch he wanted to do an article about AIDS in Columbus. And so he got a group of us together, and it was my living room, actually, and we all sat around talking about our fears. And I'll never forget, it was in the article, which I don't know whether I have a copy of it anymore or not. But my partner, who was eventually to die in 1990 of AIDS, was talking about how every night before he went to bed, he would look at the bottom of his feet. Because that was where, seemingly, for whatever reason, the KS lesions often made their first appearance. And how, you know, that was the way we all lived. And, you know, none of us were angels. We had, as I said, we were the circuit boys we went to to Provincetown every year. We went to San Juan every year. We went to Key West every year. We went to Fort Lauderdale every year. We might get to San Francisco every few years. We might get to Denver, but we were always traveling, and with both of us being teachers, our vacations were together. We had a lot of time off. We got around, and it was fabulous. I don't regret it. Why I'm here. It's wild. I assume that gene that they talk about must be in my system someplace, because there's no rationale for my sitting at this table today. None. But so it started, and I can't even describe the horror of maybe that first 5 or 6 years, 83, 84 to 89, 90, because it was almost weekly. People were going weekly. And there was no hope. I mean, there was no, it was truly in those days a death sentence. I'll never forget, we debated whether to get tested or not. Once they finally got the test, I don't even remember exactly when that was, but once they had a test, it took 4 or 5 days to get it back. And Stephen and I debated, should we get tested? Because God knows we were living scared at that point. And he just obsessed about this thing. And so one day I was home, and he came home, and he said, well, I did it. I said, you did what? He said, well, I went to Beth, who was our doctor, Beth Trainer, and he said, I went and got tested. I said, you what? I said, don't you think we should discuss this a little bit more? He said, I don't know. He said, I couldn't stand it. I've got to know. I said, okay. So I picked up the phone, and I called Beth, and I said, I'm coming in for the test. I said, if one of us is going to be tested, we both better be tested. So I went out. Then we went back a week later, and she came out, and she looked at us and said, well, sometimes there's no explanation for things. She proceeded to tell Stephen that he was HIV positive and that I was not. So anyway, that was, but the debate was, why get tested when they can't do anything? And they really couldn't do much. AZT was just coming along.
Was there a lot of panic in the community?
I don't know whether panic is the right word. Almost a fatalism to some degree, I think, at that point, because you couldn't do anything about it. And we all knew that we were, you figured that, shit, it could have been something you did 5 or 6 years ago. For those of us that had lived through all of those wild times, it was so, in most cases, it was stuff that you did before you even knew there was a problem. So not only was it not that there was a cure, but it was something you did before you knew it. It's even worse. It's like a double whammy. So I think there was for some people, I think there was a feeling that we were cursed. And there were a lot of people who just couldn't and never did do anything about it. And then there were other people who fought back. ACT UP was one of the best things that ever happened. I almost wish we still had them. I think they could shake things up a little bit. And I'm very surprised actually at the lack of a radical element within the gay community, because we don't have one. I mean, we have a pretty mainstream stuff going on, but we don't have true radicals. Why somebody didn't shoot Jesse Helms will never cease to amaze me. By some HIV positive guy who had no hope, didn't put a bullet through that son of a bitch, I'll never understand. But it shows the passivity of our community. We are really peaceful people. We are not rebels. We're not terrorists. Somehow it comes with our being, with whatever it is that makes us the way we are. I somehow think that there's something there, because I don't know whether any other explanation for that. But AIDS certainly shocked the shit out of us, and it made us act. And it started by taking care of our folks, whether it was volunteering and cleaning up the shed or taking care of some of these sick guys. God, some of the stories and some of the experiences, and I certainly wasn't on the front lines. I was never a great volunteer. There were a couple of guys that I did a lot of work with that was pretty something, but I mean, some of these folks in our community are all heroes. I mean, they belong in the pantheon. But what I could do is raise money. I don't know why. People think it's so easy for me to ask for money. I hate asking for money, but I'll do it because it has to be done. And then the political stuff.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about how you came to be involved with HRC?
Well, there's a great. I'll give you a copy of Columbus Monthly. That back when Lynn Greer was national co-chair of the Victory Fund, and I was national co-chair of the Human Rights Campaign. Columbus Monthly did an article on us, and it was sort of like, what the hell is going on here? Where did these two people come from in Columbus, Ohio, and they're, leading these national organizations? That's a great article, actually. Columbus Monthly did, I thought, an excellent job of it. Interestingly enough, just as an aside, I have never, knock on wood, had a harassing phone call. I have never been threatened. I have never gotten a letter threatening me. And I think it's absolutely amazing because my name has been out there in the New York Times, in Columbus Monthly, in Columbus Dispatch, again and again and again, and there aren't too many Shellabargers in the phone book. And I have always been amazed that nobody has ever given me a rough time. So anyway, interesting enough. So how did I get involved with HRC? Well, the reason I point that out is because it talks about that in the article. But sometime in 1982, and we were beginning the AIDS thing was sort of bubbling out there. I don't even remember what came first, to be honest with you. But I suspect that the initial AIDS stuff we had heard about. All of a sudden, we were living on Beck Street, and I got this envelope through the mail, and it was a letter from the Human Rights Campaign Fund with all of this literature and talking about the Human Rights Campaign, which in those days was this little dinky organization of an executive director by the name of Vic Basile, maybe 2 staff people. Not even sure they had 2 staff people. They might only have one, wanting me to get involved. And my first reaction was, I was furious. What son of a, this is what's quoted in, what son of a bitch gave them my name? Why did they know to, blah, blah, blah? Because I was teaching, and, you live under that. So, well, it turned out the son of a bitch was Michael Jelpy, who is actually somebody you probably need to somehow make contact with. Because he has a whole different perspective of certain things, and it'll all be about Michael, but do you know Michael at all? Did you know him before?
Yeah, I know you. Okay.
He's now in California, somewhere, South America. So, anyway, when I calmed down, then Michael called or something. Said, I gave Vic Basile your name, let's get together and talk about this. And there was a third person that was whose name you can't use. And I won't even mention his name there because he's still totally closeted. I have no idea why. Fairly prominent businessman here in town, which is, I guess, why. And so the 3 of us, Michael Jelpy, 4, Michael Jelpy and Steve Marcus, my lover, and this person and myself, the 4 of us, sat down and talked about this. And, it just, I guess Stonewall had formed by then, and in the early days, Stonewall it was really a little group of crazies in our minds, especially if you were, one of the party boys and social in crowd and all that shit. And you sort of, God, they're too radical, But when I started thinking about it, I had been a student of history and politics. It always made sense to me that when you're talking about something as basic as discrimination, all the local stuff is all fine and well. But the reality is that if we had never had a civil rights law, to this day in 2005, black people would still be segregated and discriminated against in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and other places in the South. To this day they would be. And that if you're looking at something like civil rights, federal legal action is the only thing that in the long run is going to guarantee people equality. I still believe that. And yes, you can operate on a local level and you can do all that shit, but we will never be equal until our federal government says we're equal. Period. There will be places and pockets in this country that we will continue to face discrimination. So that always made sense to me. So the concept of a national organization that did things the way everybody else does things just made all the sense in the world. So the idea appealed to me. I mean, and it was something I was able to buy into. So the four of us sat in my living room again and said, well, what can we do here? And I said, well, what do we always do? Let's have a party and raise money. So that's what we did. So we just got all of our Rolodexes out. This would have been 83. And I believe that's right. I have to trace it back, but I believe that was the first HOC event. And so we just started calling all of our friends and saying, hey, this is sort of a follow-up to Nita Bryant and blah, blah, blah. And we want you to come, and it's going to be a party, and it's $50 a person and an hors d'oeuvre. Ed Tomsick and Todd Anglin provided all the booze. We talked to them. So they, out of the Eagle, they brought all the booze. And we talked to a couple of florists, and they brought bouquets of flowers. And then we had to decide where we were going to do this. Now, we were seeing ourselves as really subversive. We were doing a gay political event. This is subversive. So we were scared. Seriously, in 1983, scared. So we tried to figure out where we were going to do this. What we came up with, I don't exactly know why. We ended up in the party room of the Americana apartment complex. And it's just a dumpy, have you ever been in it? It's just a dumpy old party room in the basement. And so the night came, and we were nervous as shit. And we actually had people posted outside because we had several of our attorneys that were out in the parking lot in case there was any kind of trouble. Of course, there wasn't. Nobody gave a shit whether we were doing anything or not. But we raised $6,000.
Wow.
And not only did we raise $6,000, but everything was donated. All the food was donated. And then we got the bright idea, well, we've got all these flower arrangements and everything, let's auction them off. So, drunk on my ass, I'm up on a stool in the middle of the thing, auctioning all this stuff off. So we made more money so our gross was more than our net, if that makes any sense, because everything was donated. We had no expenses. And we auctioned all this shit. And we had a few other little auctions. And the great story was Rob Van Order was there. You know Rob. And Rob always told this story about Stephen went up to him and kind of took him and said, "Here, look at my wife up there, drunk on her ass, auctioning that shit off, making money." That was one of the great fun stories that we told. But it was fun. It was very successful. Well, there's nothing that breeds other stuff like success. And we thought we were very successful. And Vic Basile stayed at the house because the organization had no money. And literally every penny we took in was cash. Nobody would write a check. People were afraid to put Human Rights Campaign fund down on a check. So afterwards we went back to the house and Vic and I sat there and we counted money. And he pocketed all that and he flew back and they were able to make payroll that week.
Wow.
So that was the first one, and then...
How many people would you estimate attended?
100 people, probably.
100? And was there entertainment or just a speaker?
Vic was the speaker, and I forgot to introduce him. he always laughs about that because I was so drunk I forgot to introduce him, so he never spoke. But he said I was happy to get the money. That was funny. It's so, you look back at it, it's comical. You just chuckle. So that was the beginning, and then the next year well, and the interesting thing was we had some straight people there. There were some straight supporters there, and then the next year we knew we couldn't go back to that damn basement. It was such a dump. And Rosalie Greenberg had just moved into the new Centners on Goodale, which is a beautiful design studio. And by golly, we went to Rosalie and asked her if she would consider doing it the next year. And she said, sure. Just like that. Well, and it was, so she deserves a lot of credit because she legitimized that dinner or that event. Because we were in this straight-owned, fabulous, spectacular place. And for the first 3 or 4 years, it was the same thing, $50 in an hors d'oeuvre. And then pretty soon, these queens, everybody wanted to compete against each other for having the best hors d'oeuvre. So we had, all the chefs and all these people, and I can remember Tom Johnson, who was the original L'Armagnac, came in with just this incredible, huge pate that was done in the shape of it was just unbelievable. All this wild stuff was going on. It was great. So the food was spectacular because everybody was competing against everybody else. And every year, for the first 3 or 4 years, we made more money. The gross was more than or the net was more than whatever. We took in more money than the ticket price. And we learned that the auction thing worked. And we were the first dinner in the United States to do the auction thing, the first HRC dinner. There are a lot of things that we did because we just had this. There were some really wonderfully creative people involved in those early years who worked there. Rob and Doug Polly and Vincent Roberto and Corbett and other people and so it just grew. Pretty amazing. And there again, one of the things that I think has been so wonderful about HRC here, and we get shit, but that's okay. It's elitist, it's this. There was a big controversy one year with Stonewall because they were so upset because we were raising a lot of money. And, of course, in their view, it was all leaving town, which, of course, is bunk because you're going up and you're lobbying a lot of money. But we've got more AIDS money back from HRC lobbying in Columbus, Ohio than we've ever sent out. But it's hard to explain that to people who have some degree of sophistication about the way the system works. But Stonewall was particularly upset, and I understand that coming from their point of view. So I finally, and I don't remember whether it was Chris or somebody, and they were bitching at me about this, and I said, wait a second. I want you to sit down with your donor list, and you look at your donor list, and especially because they kept getting, Stonewall was growing, and it's grown every year, I said, you look at your donor list, and I will tell you which ones are on that list that became activists because of HRC. I said, had Stonewall gone to these people and asked them for money, they would never have given you money until they had become active with HRC. Once they became active in what was socially acceptable, sounds awful, but it brought people into the movement. And then, once they become radicalized, then it begins to filter elsewhere. Then they begin to give to Stonewall. Then they begin to give to Bravo. Then they begin to give to all these other organizations that they would never have given to. You have to have the entree for people to become activists. And I think that's what HRCF and HRC now has done. It gives people a way to become involved, and it's just amazing to watch as people, sort of put their big toe in the water, and within a couple of years they're on the board of Stonewall or they're doing something over here. They would never have initially gone to a Stonewall event. So the money gets spread out but we've got to bring them in, and this is the best way to bring them in. And there are cities and I would be willing to almost bet that you can go to some major cities in this country that do not have HRC activism, and their local organization suffers because they don't have big donors. And they don't have that more professional element within our community that are doing stuff for them because they've never been brought in. And those folks are sitting on their hands doing virtually nothing. And I don't know that for a fact, but I just suspect that if you think of organizations that have really effective local organizations, they also have effective HRC organizations. And those that don't are different. And I look at cities like Dayton, and I look at little cities, Pittsburgh, Indianapolis. They don't have really great local organizations, and they certainly aren't well funded. So I think that it really filters down to trickle down theory.
So when was it that you made the transition from Republican to rabid Democrat?
Well, I didn't make the transition. They made the transition.
All right, well, when was it this transition took place?
Oh, it's sort of interesting because I was under the influence of such good, strong Democrats when I was teaching in Whitehall, and we used to have all these battles. But I had a wonderful, the head of our department was a fellow by the name of Jim Friday, who was a good old Mississippi Democrat, New Deal Democrat, and he taught me a lot. So I guess I was probably well on my way but you can almost trace it by who you vote for, My first election would have been 68. Yeah, because in 64 I would not have been 21. That's how far back I go. You had to be 21 to vote. And I voted for Nixon in 72, much to my chagrin. Jesus, that was a smart vote, wasn't it? But I think that it was sort of all happening in the 70s. I mean, even though I was still a registered Republican, I was voting more and more Democratic. And I don't know, it was a combination of things, my union activities, but the gay issue was certainly there. I mean, and it was pretty obvious pretty quick that where the future was going to be if there was going to be any kind of gay equality in this country. It certainly wasn't going to come through the Republican Party. And then, but the Republican Party is what's changed. I don't think I've really changed all that much. I was always a civil libertarian, even when I was a Republican. They're the ones that have moved away from civil libertarianism and towards this, or Taliban. And I will be a Republican tomorrow if the Democratic Party begins to do stupid crap and the Republicans somehow come around. I have no gumption about changing parties again. I don't understand these people that feel some crazy allegiance to a political party. Like, well, I was born and raised a Republican. Well, who cares? So what does that have to do with the time of day? It has to do with issues and so forth. So I mean, if the parties change again, hey, I'm gone. I'm not that kind of a Democrat. I'm a Democrat because the Democratic Party stands for the right things today. If it doesn't stand for the right things next year, I'm out of there.
So what led you to then get involved in local politics as far as elections and races and that sort of thing?
Oh, I don't know. The thing was that we started with the HRC dinner, and within a few years, we had made enough contacts that we had a lot of politicians coming to those dinners. And in fact, we used to have a lot more than we do now. It's because we don't make the effort. We can have them still. It's just that it's not in those days it had to do with legitimacy. Today it's not so important. We know we're legitimate, so that's not the issue. But in the early days it had to do with that. And I don't know, you get to know people, and then it's a natural transition when you're involved with, this organization to become more and more involved with the political stuff. It's where it's won and lost, God, people don't realize the disaster that, we're living with right now. If If the Republicans were not in charge of the state of Ohio, we would never have had issue 1. It's as simple as that. If Bill Clinton were still president of the United States, things would be a whole lot different in terms of atmosphere for gay people in this country. Just the way it is. And anybody who doesn't think that is, I don't know what they're smoking. Bill Clinton did more for gay people in this country than anybody has ever done. Period. And there are a lot of gay people that love to sit around and bash him, and they're just dumbasses. He changed the atmosphere for gay people in this country. And if that foolish, stupid older Bush had been reelected and Clinton had been defeated, we would not be anywhere close to where we are today. He changed the atmosphere. People don't understand. That's what. So, well, we didn't pass any laws. No, we didn't pass any laws. But the atmosphere changed. We were invited to sit down, and our issues became legitimate, debatable issues in American society. And without Bill Clinton, that would never have happened. There would have been no debate over Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There would have been no debate over ENDA. There would be no debate about anything, except for the fact that Bill Clinton was president of the United States for 8 years. And he let us in. And it just drives me nuts to hear gay people banned. It's crazy. It is absolutely crazy. But I do think that an awful lot of gay people, not much, but an awful lot of gay people are really politically unsophisticated. I think that's one of our biggest jobs, is to teach people that they've got to be politically sophisticated. And politically sophisticated is not a bunch of log-cabin Republicans who go suck butt just because they give them the time of day. And then go off and dutifully vote for a bunch of people who are going to undermine their position and want us to go back in the closet. It just makes no sense. If they want to claim to be Republicans and go off and do their attempts at lobbying and so forth, and then declare before an election, well, we failed again, sorry, we can't, these people are still our enemies, so we're going to vote for the Democrats, but we're going to continue to try and bring them around. Well, that's one thing, but they don't do that. Instead, they go out and suck up with these people. That's not political sophistication, that's political stupidity.
You were the first president of the local gay democratic organization.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, I guess.
How did that come about?
Well, I'll tell you. When I was on the HRC board, and I was co-chair for 2 years, and it's a very interesting thing. The Human Rights Campaign really makes an effort to get Republicans on the board. And actually, when I went on the board, I was Republican. But what happens is, the more deeply you get involved and the more you really see what's going on, the more you understand that being a Republican and being gay is idiocy. And so what happens is everybody changes. So pretty soon, within a couple of years, they bring on a Republican or two, and then within a couple of years, they're not Republicans anymore. So they're going to go out and recruit some more. So they can always, they like to be able to say that we're not a partisan organization, which is fine, whether it's real or not. But so what happened all the time was that Log Cabin would always beat up on HRC. It was continual. They would always beat up on HRC. As if HRC were, if there were Democrats that took the position that Republicans that HRC supports would take, we'd never support them in a million years. It's just a totally lower standard. Totally lower standard. So, I got really tired of watching HRC get continually beat up by Log Cabin as if it was HRC on the left and Log Cabin on the right. And so what made sense to me was to have good gay Democratic clubs that would put us, the Democratic clubs, on the left, Log Cabins on the right, and leave HRC where it belongs. And because we had a very vocal and active Log Cabin club here in town, I just got fed up with it. And so that was when I got on the phone, called a few people, and said, let's see if we can't start a Democratic organization. And this was before the National Stonewall Dance came along, I guess. A little bit before. Oh, it was horrendous. One of the hardest things I've ever done. We had meetings. There was one guy, I don't remember who it was. Were you at some of those meetings? Who was that jackass that used to come to the meetings and, remember when we're trying to write, because you were writing, you got stuck with writing the whole damn bylaws.
And Jeff Ayers.
Who was that jerk? And he never, once we approved the bylaws, which of course nobody's ever looked at since, he disappeared. He's never come to a meeting. But I think he was a log cabin plant. Who was that? That was you and Jeff, but that was the whole idea. I mean, it just seemed to me that we had to do something. Because it just drove me nuts. I get tired of fighting with log cabin as if I'm the HRC is the enemy of log cabin. That was the while, because Lynn and I were doing the national stuff. And so the Clinton campaign came out. And we really wanted, I was rabid then. I'm lazy now. I don't do shit anymore. But in those days, I was pretty gung-ho. And it was shortly after Steve had died, and I think that impacted me too. But, so Lynn and I got together, and we started putting together something to try and help the Clinton campaign. Shit, we didn't know what the hell we were doing. And the next day she calls me, she says, "The New York Times is coming." I said, "What?" She said, we have a meeting on Sunday. She said, "The New York Times is coming in. They want to do an article on what we're doing for the Clinton campaign." And I said, "You're putting me on." She said, "No." So we were up there, and Jesus Christ, the next week, 2 month, or whatever it was, there's a damn article in the New York Times magazine about the gay community in the Clinton campaign with a real focus on Columbus. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And we laughed so hard, and all of the, Vic Basile called me, and he said, "I don't know how you guys do it." He said, "You're just charmed." He said, "There isn't any of us in Washington that wouldn't give our left nut to get coverage in the New York Times magazine section. And here, we pick it up, and here you guys are in Columbus, Ohio, getting all this coverage."
I know you touched on this a little bit in what we've talked about already, but what do you think it was that motivated you to get involved in all this gay stuff? What was it that drove you to get involved with the AIDS crisis, to get involved with HRC, to get involved with the Democratic politics?
I don't know. I think a little of it's upbringing. My family, my father was always involved in community things. So I was brought up, and it was instilled in me that you pay back. So I suppose there's a little of that. My mother was one of the people that Children's Hospital in Dayton started, which is now a huge, thriving thing, but she was there, doing all the grunt work early on. So, I mean, community stuff has always been a part of what I was brought up with, and I just did that. And I've always had political interests, probably some political ambitions at one time. I think if I had been straight, I probably would have been one of those crazy right-wing nutcase Republicans from some little burg in northern Ohio or someplace. I sometimes turn it around, though, and I wonder why more people are motivated. Because it's just so natural to me, and how people can sit back and watch injustice and watch unfairness and watch people hurt and suffer and be treated wrong and not do anything about it. I don't know. I've never been able to figure that out. I just can't do that. Is there some self-interest involved in it? Sure. You relate to it because it impacts you. And so AIDS scared the shit out of us. And once that we exposed, AIDS exposed the prejudice and the and what prejudice does. AIDS really exposed that, because any other community wouldn't have taken 10 years to motivate our government. Literally, I don't think there's another community that could have been impacted that would have been looked at as lepers by our government, and that's who we were looking at. Ronald Reagan, that stupid old fool. Nice guy, maybe. Stupid old fool who, the damage that Ronald Reagan, the millions of people that will die because Ronald Reagan was president when he was president, is just phenomenal. It isn't going to be the thousands that died while he was president. It's going to be Ronald Reagan prevented anything from happening to solving the AIDS crisis for 8 years. So it's the last 8 years when we finally come up with a solution to AIDS. It's all the people that died 8 years before that solution that are on his head. And that's only millions of people. And they make him, we're going to name airports after him. It just makes me want to gag. And gay people who think Ronald Reagan is hot shit, they're idiots. But I don't know why more people aren't motivated. I mean, look around. I don't know.
When you think about your own personal involvement, is there one thing or a couple of things that you think, gosh, that's what I'm really proud of, that meant the most to me, or that's where I think I made a real difference?
I don't know, I may have told you this once before. I think the thing that I actually sat back and enjoyed, in a perverse sort of way, I guess, but it was more gratifying, perhaps, was the Matthew Shepard rally.
It's funny you should say that, because I was just thinking about that a moment ago and how miraculously that came together.
Well, I didn't have that much to do it, and Jeff Redfield deserves a ton of credit, because once motivated, he and Stonewall did a fabulous job. It was one of those situations where my instincts told me that we had to act. And it was a terrible weekend. It was a holiday weekend. I forget which holiday, but it was a holiday weekend. And when Matthew Shepard died, Andy and I were sitting, my partner now, were sitting around, and I was devastated. I mean, it could have been any of us. Any of us could have had that happen. There's one of us. There isn't a gay man or gay woman that I know that hasn't, at some point, put themselves in a position where they could have ended up on that fence. And it was so cruel. And so that was what was going through my mind. And I thought, we've got to take advantage of it. This is so tragic, but we can't let it pass. And that was when I called, and I couldn't, no one was around. I got busy, and I finally got a hold of Jeff, and I said, Jeff, we can't let this. We put a big sign up on our porch, German Village, and it just said simply, I am Matthew Shepard, because I thought, to me, that was, because I'm Matthew Shepard. You are, and you could even be a straight person. And if they mistook you for a gay person, you were Matthew Shepard, in the wrong place at the wrong time. You're on that fence. So, when in a matter of 2 days, or whatever it was, and we had 800 people with candles, and the mayor, and I don't know, it was just one of the most beautiful community events I think I've ever been in. And if I had anything to do with making that happen, I think that was one of the most gratifying. It was a horrible night. So, anyway, and I don't think much about it. I'm not really associated with that, but which is great. It's kind of nice to have been able to push something from mine. Jeff did a great job, and they put that together, and they contacted all the right people, and all of the people out there. It was wonderful.
It truly was. It truly was.
It was just, one night, it was about the fourth dinner, we decided, because we were being accused of being elitist, and the dinner was going to be at the Old Players Theater, out on, that old section, you know where I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I forget what that street's called, Lincoln Street or something. Stuff like that. But,
I know what you mean.
so we said, okay, let's do an outreach the night before. The dinner's on Saturday night. So we talked to DB, and that was when he had trends in the garage. And DB, can we have the back bar on Friday night early? Yeah, he totally went along with us. And it was the Statue of Liberty year. It was the bicentennial of the Statue of Liberty, I think. Because Corbett did statues of liberty, huge statues of liberty. We went down and we had door prizes donated, we had all kinds of stuff. It was low ticket, it was like $5 entry or something. And people just worked their asses off. I mean, all of my friends have been, if I've ever accomplished anything, it's because I have this wonderful group of friends who would always work their asses off to make these parties happen. Because, they're a lot of work. And they never let me down. Never. Vincent Roberto and Chuck Cataline and Dick Murphy and Doug Pauly, and half of these people are all dead now. But they never, ever. They always thought I was a little nuts. But so we did this party, and Corbett made these huge sets. And it was fabulous. And we had quite a few people came and gave their $5, but it was all about partying. And no one could talk to them. You couldn't get a message out. It was just a big party. And then these poor bastards, all of us, because, we were right there too, we had to tear down everything and move it to Players Theater and put it all up for the big party. So down came all the decorations. Down came all the giant statues of liberty. Down came the big statue of liberty that Corbett had made. There's this wild-ass green thing, this sculpture. Down came everything. Loaded it at 10 o'clock at night, because we had to be out of there so that the bar could open up at 11. Hauled it all to Players Theater. People were up all night long to put this, because this was our outreach to all these people who didn't give a shit about what was going on. They just wanted to have a party and have door prizes. That's the last time we ever did that. But those poor guys, there were so many. There were 50 people on that committee who just, half of them didn't make it to the dinner the next night because they were so damn tired out from tearing down and putting back up. They were amazing. Just amazing. So there are all those people, just do all this stuff and never get the credit for anything. But that's what makes the whole community work. If it weren't for all those people, all those volunteers, it's amazing.